Well, hello and welcome to VKind Connects. I'm your host, Shabnam Islam. And today we have the incredible Paul Shapiro. Paul is the author of Clean Meat, How Growing Meat Without Animals Will Revolutionize Dinner and the World. He's also the CEO and co-founder of the Better Meat Co., the host of the Business for Good podcast, and four-time TEDx speaker. Paul, it is an absolute pleasure to have you today.
Shabnam, the pleasure is all mine. Thanks so much. If people are listening, you can't see that Shabnam is wearing a really cool VKind shirt with this, like it says VKind vegan vibes, with a rabbit who has like little ears that are also kind of playing as leaves, and it's very cool. It's a very nice shirt.
So, Paul, you are not new to animal advocacy. Tell us a little bit about your start here.
Well, Shabnam, I definitely am not new to it. I now am over the hill. So I became really interested in animals at a very young age. And what ended up happening was basically I learned how animals are treated on factory farms and in slaughter plants. And this was back in the early 90s. This wasn't a time where there was YouTube or even internet for people to look. But a friend of mine showed me this video. He had like a VHS video. So this is, for those of you who don't know what that is, yeah, it's like a rectangular piece of plastic that you put in this machine and it projected your video. And I was really horrified. I couldn't believe it. And I thought, if I wouldn't want that to happen to my own dogs, who I loved, why would I want it to happen to any animals? And so I became vegetarian. And at that time, I didn't know anything about being vegan. I never contemplated it, but I wrote to all these animal advocacy groups and said, please send me information about vegetarianism. And they sent me back information about what I thought was vegan. I was like, what's this veganism thing they were talking about? And I was like, it sounds interesting. It sounds cool. But like, I really believed at the time, if you were not going to eat any animal products at all, I mean, being vegetarian is one thing, but I thought if you're not going to eat any animal products, it's kind of like holding your breath. Like I thought, you can hold your breath for some amount of time, but if you do it too long, you'll die. And I thought, maybe you can go without meat, eggs, or dairy for some amount of time, but if you do it too long, you'll probably die. And so I didn't do it. And then I started getting more from these groups, and I read an interview with Carl Lewis. Now, for those of you who don't remember, Carl Lewis was like the #1 US Olympian at that era. He was kind of like the Usain Bolt of the era, like the best athlete on the planet, right? And I worshipped Carl Lewis. I had his poster on my wall. I was like just totally obsessed with Carl Lewis. And in the interview, he talked about how not only was he one of what I thought was vegan, but that his best years during the Olympics were not eating any animal products. And I thought, wow, if this guy who is like the pinnacle of athleticism doesn't eat any animal products, I can do that too. And so I became a vegan and then started volunteering at animal advocacy groups as a young teenager and learned that they were actually vegans, not vegans. And now here I am, still abstaining from eating animals. But in that process, I founded an organization called Compassion Over Killing, which I ran for a number of years, which focused on conducting exposés at slaughter plants and factory farms, and then spent nearly a decade and a half at the Humane Society, where I worked on passing laws to help protect farm animals. And then toward the beginning of 2018, got very passionate. Well, excuse me, let me back up. Around 2015 and 16, I started really questioning whether I thought food technology might even do more good for animals than what I was doing. And so I decided to write a book about it. And I wrote this book called Clean Meat, which you kindly mentioned, Shabnam. It's called Clean Meat, How Growing Meat Without Animals Will Revolutionize Dinner in the World. And the basic premise of that book is that it's possible that food technologies may make the exploitation of animals obsolete. So not just that we'll get animals better living conditions, but actually their exploitation will become obsolete. And after I released that book at the very beginning of 2018, I really had a decision. I could continue doing like public lobbying campaigns for animals to get better conditions for animals. I could continue writing about people who I thought were going to help animals via food technology, or I could just become one of them. And I chose that latter path and decided to start my own company, the Better Meat Co., which harnesses the power of fermentation to create meat experiences without animals. So that is probably more long-winded than you wanted, but that's in a nutshell the last 3 decades of my life here.
Well, actually, you segued right into what we're going to be talking about. Like you talk about, we hear about clean meat. What is clean meat? Apparently, there's more than one way to grow a chicken these days.
Apparently, that's right, Shabnam. You're absolutely correct. So, look, the way that we have gotten meat in the past and in the present is basically by killing animals and taking it out of their bodies. But in the same way that for thousands of years, the only way we had to get ice was out of nature, right? So you get frozen blocks of ice and we put them on ships that were insulated and we shipped them all around the world for people to have ice in their in-home ice boxes for a very long time. But then enter the advent of refrigeration. And all of a sudden, we had a way to get ice, not from nature, but through human technology. And it's the same thing. It's still ice, but it's just made through technology rather than through nature. Well, similarly, we now have technology that enables us to create actual animal meat, not a substitute, not an alternative, but actual animal meat, not by slaughtering chickens and pigs and cows and other animals, but by simply growing their microscopic cells. And so you can take the cells from a tiny biopsy, like the biopsy the size of a sesame seed. And from that, you literally could produce millions of pounds of meat. And that meat, again, is real animal meat. And so there are dozens of companies that are now doing this. They're not commercialized in the United States, although one of them is commercialized in Singapore now. But that's what the topic of my book, Clean Meat, is about, is this race to bring the world's first slaughter-free meat to the world's tables.
And as you say, there are multiple ways of doing it. We call lab-grown meat, cultured meat, in vitro meat. It's grown from stem cells, so it's animal-based. However, I was reading about something like there's a gel-based or non-animal source. Particularly, the Better Meat Co. produces something from mycoproteins.
Yes, exactly. So, it's really interesting you mentioned this. So, if you think about the problem of fossil fuels, we need lots of alternatives, So let's say you want solar, you want wind, you want geothermal. There's lots of ways to make energy without fossil fuels, right? Well, similarly, there's lots of ways to create meat experiences without animals. So one of them is what we were just talking about, which is clean meat or cultivated meat, which is basically animal cells that are grown into animal meat. And there's another way there, if you don't want to use the animal kingdom, you can go to the plant kingdom and you can do what companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods do, which is take plants like soybeans or wheat or peas and convert them into things that look like animal meat. Or you can then go, if you don't want to go to the plant kingdom or the animal kingdom, you can do what we at the Better Meat Co. do, which is use the fungi kingdom. And so we harness the power of fermentation to take little microscopic fungi and feed them. So in the same way that a cow eats grass and converts that grass into a steak, we take little tiny microscopic fungi and we feed them things like corn byproducts and potato byproducts, and we let them convert it into something that ultimately looks like a steak. And yet the difference is, of course, there's no animal cruelty involved, and it's much lighter on the planet as well. However, a cow takes more than a year of feeding her before they slaughter her to get that steak. Our little tiny microscopic fungi take less than one single day before we harvest them. So we inoculate our fermenter, and a day later, less than a day later, we are harvesting them and producing a product that as you pointed out, Shabnam, is called mycoprotein. We call it rhiza mycoprotein. And that mycoprotein on its own, without almost any processing whatsoever, not only has a very meat-like texture, but it has more protein than eggs, and it's a complete protein source, so it has all the essential amino acids. It has more iron than beef. It has more fiber than oats, more potassium than bananas, and unlike plant foods, because it's the product of microbial fermentation, it has naturally containing vitamin B12. So this is a real superfood for vegans because not only does it have no animal origin, but it's very meat-like and it's high in protein, iron, and B12. This really is a wonderful food, of course, for vegans like you and me, but also for anybody who likes to eat meat and doesn't want to have to do so much harm to the planet and animals in the process.
Right. So there's absolutely no animal intervention with the use of rhiza mycoprotein, correct?
That's exactly right. We don't use animal cells. We don't use any animal ingredients. It's entirely animal-free.
And to be honest, this is, as an exercise physiologist, clinical physiologist, it's difficult for me to talk about how clean is meat, right? When we talk about clean meat, we also need to consider things like that scientific evidence shows that dietary cholesterol is only found in animal protein, right? And these animal sources contain hemi-iron. This high hemi intake is actually what's associated with increased risk of type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, all these obesity-related issues. So even if you do consume something like a lab-grown meat, aside from the fact that it's taken from a stem cell, wouldn't it still have this kind of impact on the human system?
It's possible. So you can create meat that is the same as regular meat that would have cholesterol, et cetera, in it. However, you could also, create burgers that instead of having saturated fat could have omega-3 fatty acids. So maybe you'd have a burger that instead of causing heart attacks helps to prevent them. Nobody's done that yet, but it's theoretically possible that you could do it. But the reason why people like to call it clean meat really has to do with that. It's just like clean energy, so it's better for the planet. So it's a cleaner way to produce meat, and it is literally cleaner. So if you think about like conventional meat, which comes from slaughtered animals, you have to, when it's in the supermarket, treat it like toxic waste. If you have raw meat, you put it in your supermarket basket. They tell you don't let it touch your other groceries. They put it in a different bag. You bring it home. It touches your counter. You got to disinfect your counter. If it touches your hands, you got to wash your hands. The reason is because there is feces on the meat. It's Salmonella, E. coli, Campylobacter. These are intestinal pathogens that can sicken us if we don't literally cook the crap out of the meat. That's what you're doing. You're literally cooking the crap out of the meat. Whereas with clean meat, you don't have to worry so much about these intestinal pathogens like E. coli because you're not growing intestines at all. You're just growing that muscle that you want. And so there is an argument to be made that from a food safety perspective, it's also cleaner. The issues that you're talking about, though, like coronary heart disease and other problems that are associated with high levels of meat consumption could still be present. So if somebody's interest is only in, let's say, climate change or animal welfare, this doesn't present a concern. But if somebody doesn't want to eat meat because they perceive it as something that's unhealthy for them, it's very possible that this would continue to be that type of a product for you. But in that case, there's still plenty of plant-based meat and mycoprotein-based products that are still awesome, that are totally animal-free, cholesterol-free, and oftentimes have less saturated fat than animal meat does.
I love that. I mean, and you even recently published a piece titled, Will Making Meat Without Animals Help Prevent the Next Pandemic? Right? I mean, you're taking into account the alignment of the United Nations 2020 Environmental Program publication that we are affected by zoonotic diseases, and another novel coronavirus may occur because of the way we produce animal agriculture.
Yeah, you're so right, Shabnam. Listen, the United Nations put out a report recently. It's called Preventing the Next Pandemic. You can go look it up. And they listed the top reasons why we might have another pandemic, not the current COVID pandemic, but another pandemic. And number one on the UN list is increased demand for animal protein. Number two on their list is intensification of agriculture, so confining more and more animals in smaller and smaller spaces. Number three on the UN's list is the demand for bushmeat, or so-called like wildlife slaughter for their meat. And so the numbers 1, 2, and 3 reasons the UN says we are likely to have another pandemic all relate to humanity's desire to eat meat. And so the question is, how can we satiate humanity's meat tooth, so to speak, without the need for animals? Because yes, we need to replace fossil fuels and energy, but we also need to replace animals in meat. And so just in the same way that, if you walk into a room and you flick on a light switch, that light comes down, you're not thinking to yourself, oh, is this coming from coal? Is it coming from oil? Is it coming from wind or solar? You just want light. You just want an illuminated room. When most people, when they eat meat, they are not thinking to themselves, I'm so glad an animal was slaughtered for this. They don't think about it. Like, if anything, they might prefer an animal not be slaughtered. So if we can replicate that experience, if we can create light without fossil fuels, and we can create the meat experience without animals, just think about what a better world it would be. Sure, for the animals, which is really a huge motivating factor for me, but also for preventing the next pandemic, which is also a huge motivating factor for anybody. I mean, we've all been really harmed by the pandemic, obviously. And so the question is, what can we do to minimize that? And too many people, when they think about the next pandemic, they think, oh, well, we need more masks or more ventilators. Like, how about just preventing it from happening in the first place? And the big reason that the UN says we may have another pandemic relates to eating animals. So let's find a way to do it that is more humane and more sustainable and less risky.
So I just want to kind of pop back in because you said something about like unsustainable agricultural intensification, right? So something like 83% of the world's farmland provides 18% of the world's calories. Some sort of statistic of that nature. But in your book, you really talk about a first domestication versus the second domestication, and the need for that is clean meat. Can you differentiate that for our viewers?
Yeah, sure. So the first domestication is generally thought of as when humanity, about 10 or 12,000 years ago, started selectively breeding both plants and animals so that we could control them. So rather than just foraging for our food, we started growing food and raising animals. Well, now we've had thousands of years of that domestication process. And instead of domesticating entire organisms, like let's say a plant or an animal, now we're starting to domesticate cells. And that is what is called the second domestication, where we are going down to the microscopic level and picking the best cell lines, not the best plants or the best animals, but the best cell lines, and creating products from them that are delicious and nutritious and sustainable, so that we don't have to deforest the planet in order to feed ourselves, that we can continue to produce food that humans want to eat without having to destroy the rest of the species on the planet along with it.
Absolutely. And are we getting any kind of legislative support for this anywhere?
There is some support, yes. So shamefully, the governments of the world still, including in the United States, are still giving billions of dollars out to the animal agriculture industry. In fact, just recently, the federal government announced a $1 billion program to expand slaughter capacity in the United States. So, what I'm about to say is we should keep in mind what the big picture is. However, the US government has also started funding what is now called alternative protein. So UC Davis, which is near where I live in Sacramento, California, received a $3.5 million grant to study cultivated meat or clean meat. Tufts University received a $10 million federal grant in order to study these alternative proteins as well. So there is some support from the federal government starting to trickle in. It's dwarfed by its support for animal agriculture, but it's starting to trickle in. And we need more. It's a good start, but we need a lot more.
Let's talk about that cost of investment and resources. I mean, is this this new way of clean meat actually sustainable? When I was doing some research, I saw that the cost of investment for the first pound of lab-grown beef costs anywhere between $285,000 and $330,000 to produce.
Yeah.
But now it's suggested that the average patty could go for $10, a
That's
patty.
right.
But really, when we look about cost of investment, it's not just the financial investment. We're talking about water and carbon footprint, right?
You're so right, Shabnam. So, the prices come down precipitously in the last decade for producing these products. However, one thing to keep in mind is there is an inherent advantage that you're referring to here, which is that these products take a lot less land, a lot less water. They emit far fewer greenhouse gas emissions. And so once they scale, the hope is that we can get down to beneath the current prices of conventional meat. Conventional meat is cheap for a number of reasons, one of which is that it is hugely scaled up. You have massive companies that control this market, and with economies of scale, you can bring your unit cost down, and that's how they do it. We need to do the same in the alternative protein space. If we ever want alternative protein to stop being alternative and to become mainstream and actually displace animal meat, we have to compete on cost. We cannot just have a product that tastes great and is better for the planet, but costs 2 or 3 times more than what the conventional product costs. That's a great way to maybe make a business where you have a niche product. It's not a great way to actually create a commodity market where you displace the billions of animals who are currently suffering in factory farms. So this industry needs to scale up, and it needs to have automation, and it needs to have all the other things that have helped to make the price of meat so cheap in order to actually compete and do the good in the world that this industry is promising to do.
So would you say that is capitalizing veganism the way to instill change? I mean, if you take a look, we've got KFC, Burger King, McDonald's jumping on board, even Tyson Foods invested $161 million in Memphis meat.
So I would look at it like this. If you think about the 1990s and you had a massive war in the film industry between companies like Kodak and companies like Canon, and they were vying for supremacy. And they both knew about digital, but Kodak was concerned that digital was going to cannibalize their core business of selling negatives and darkroom chemicals and all the other things that you had to do to make photos back then. Canon said, well, we think this will cannibalize our core business, but we also think it's the future, and so we are going to embrace it. And we all know what happened. You fast forward a couple of decades and Kodak goes bankrupt, and Canon now is the largest manufacturer of digital cameras on the planet. They're still selling us the same thing. They're still selling us a way to capture our memories. That's what photos do for us. But they're doing it in a far more efficient and convenient way for us. Now, rather than having to wait an hour or days to get our photos, we get it absolutely instantly. And so I think that there are some companies in the meat industry that are more like Kodak, that are thinking to themselves, oh, we've always slaughtered animals, we'll always continue slaughtering animals. But there are some Canons out there, and they think, yes, this may be the way of the future, and they want to invest in it so that they can continue to sell meat just without animals. So those type of forward-thinking companies, I think, are going to be poised to do the best. And this story is repeated not just in, let's say, the film industry, but let's say you look at Blockbuster. None of us go to video stores to get our videos anymore because we're all streaming. But before that, where was mail DVDs, or is that what Netflix originally was? And Netflix displaced Blockbuster, a very successful company, by making it more convenient just to get DVDs sent to you by mail. And then they knew that streaming was going to be the way of the future. And so they cannibalized their core business model of basically mail-in DVDs and switched to streaming. And those are the type of innovative companies that'll survive. But for companies that think, hey, we're going to just keep slaughtering animals into the future, I don't think they're going to do that well.
So how would you try and promote clean meat to maybe the most adamant anti-clean meat person out there?
Well, it depends on why they're so anti. So are they anti because they're already vegan and they don't want to eat meat?
Let's say that hardcore vegan that we are trying to bring on board to get everybody to just try a little bit more plant-based.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first, let's start with the hardcore vegan. So first, don't eat it. It's fine. The purpose of it is to have meat eaters eat this rather than animals. So if the hardcore vegan doesn't want to eat it, that's great. No problem. Go and enjoy a bean and rice burrito and hummus and lentil soup and so on. Those are awesome foods. I love them. My wife is a vegan cookbook author. Go get her cookbooks and you can make all those awesome products. So that's number one.
Nice little plug.
Number two, yeah, thank you. Number two, for somebody who is more thinking about it in terms of whether they feel comfortable eating it, people say, oh, this seems kind of novel. I think that's a understandable point of view, that things that are novel, we oftentimes fear. However, these foods are safe. And there's been really a lot of work done showing that we can make these foods and make them in a way that actually is safer from a food safety perspective than the way that conventional meat is made today. And so I really believe that it's imperative for us to remember that they are safe, that they're fine to eat, and that they're better for the planet. And I think those are some of the key messages that I think will resonate with people. Maybe not everybody, but we don't need everybody to eat it. Like if you could envision even 10%, if you could see 10% of the meat industry going to alternative meat that's animal free, not only would billions of animals globally be spared, but you would have such a major shift that it would probably have some cascade effects throughout the entire industry as well, because this industry is based on this constant growth and economies of scale. So I think you could see a rapid transition over a period of a few decades, similar to how we went from Blockbuster to streaming, and similar how we went from 1 hour photo to digital. And now it's not even 1 second photo; it's instant photo. So that's what I think could happen. And you only need a certain group of people at first to start, but those will be the early adopters, the early pioneers. And while I don't think it matters whether vegans eat it or not, I do think it's important for vegans to not criticize it and for vegans to support it, to say, hey, listen, this is an innovation that is going to help animals and the planet. Trust me, I would love, if everybody wanted to eat a whole foods plant-based diet, that would be awesome. That's how I eat most of the time. But I really believe that people want that meat experience. It's kind of like saying it would be great if people would just walk and bike rather than drive and fly. But a lot of people want to drive and fly. And so we got to find ways to make cars that don't involve fossil fuels, as an example. And I think it would be great if people just wanted to eat bean and rice burritos. It'd be awesome. But a lot of people want meat. And so we got to find ways to give them meat that will satiate them, that don't involve animals.
Right. And we just need to find a way to live better. And that's what the Better Meat Co. does. So thank you.
Exactly.
So thank you so much, Paul, for sharing your time and your insight with us today. And I believe that wraps up this episode of VKind Connects with Paul Shapiro. To watch this episode and many more, make sure to subscribe to us on YouTube at the VKind Vibes channel. And stay connected with us on Instagram and download the VKind app today.
On episode 1 of Vibes, we're taking you inside Bestie's Vegan Paradise, the 100% vegan marketplace in East Hollywood. There, we'll meet with co-founder and owner Asia Rain and learn more about the story behind Hollywood's favorite vegan grocery store. Our co-hosts, professor and television host Shabnam Islam and LA-based actor and writer Jill Galbraith, will face off in a cruelty-free contest inspired by Supermarket Sweep inside of Bestie's. Come join us for an exciting first episode of Vibes, the show that's busting vegan stereotypes one city at a time.